Chapter 15. Jarvie's attention immediately perked when he heard about the supply run. Kevin was just reckless enough to leave the safety city to get some supplies. Doc was likely too, but Kevin was far more reckless. Ultimately, though, it didn't matter which of them went on the supply run. The situation had to be checked out. Laura asked after he explained all of this, "Do you really, seriously plan to do this?"
"What's the big deal?"
"This has trap written all over it."
"What? There is no way they could know I've got intelligent sources inside the town."
Laura laughed. "Didn't you check the list of things not to do when trying to conquer the world? I'm telling you, going into that town is a really bad idea." Jarvie laughed. He wanted to ignore her, but if he did, he wouldn't be making his own path. Of course, if he just followed her, he'd have no path at all.
"And what if there is something important in there?"
"Send one of the fire zombies instead. They've got minds. And if you don't want to send one of them, send one of the soldiers." He turned around and put his hands on his hips.
"You've got to be out of your mind. Doc and company have it in for me. I am not sending them anywhere that might mean my ass. Fine, fire zombie it is."
He snapped his fingers and summoned Ozark to him.
"You, go check out that boat and find out if I should care what's on it."
Ozark flew up into the night and across the reservoir. She was pleased that she had been able to save Doc. There was indeed hope she could stop most of the insanity going on. She had been looking for ways to kill Jarvie, but hadn't found any yet. She couldn't hold a gun without it smelting in her hands. She landed in front of the boat and immediately sensed that something was wrong with the situation. The name of the boat looked changed, and there was residual heat tracks all over the place. A large number of people had already been there. It was probably some kind of a trap. As she thought about ways to turn this to her advantage, perhaps she could trick Jarvie into coming here. She felt a compelling pressure in the back of her mind. It was compelling her to go and check out the boat. Shit, she muttered to herself as she moved forward and touched the boat. She had successfully gone to the boat. The problem was that while she knew she could go back and tell him it was a trap, she had to think of some reason that would justify going back without letting him know that. His words. Should he care or not about what was on board? Were open to interpretation. She walked up the gangway and moved carefully around. Rope. It was full of rope. Rope was extremely useful. He should care about that. She had to keep playing mind games with herself to justify not telling him what she found, because he probably wasn't going to care about it. She was so distracted trying to come up with excuses not to have to go back and tell him something stupid that she didn't notice the tripwire. The explosion was titanic. She didn't even have time to finish a thought before it ripped her to shreds. She could have absorbed the heat, but not the force of the blast. It took her a moment to realize that she really was entirely all the way dead this time. The world seemed to look the same, though there were unusual colors she had never seen before. The ever-so-cliché white light appeared in the distance, calling her toward it. She felt that going toward it was the right thing to do, but she wasn't going to go just yet. Just to test that she was really dead, she moved her hand through some of the rock left by the crater where the boat used to be. It went right through. Was the white light there because she expected it to be, or because it really was there? Her body began to feel wrong. Light, sound, and heat were slowly beginning to fade away. Whatever was left of her was beginning to realize that she didn't have a body anymore, and if she didn't have a body, how was she going to affect the material world in a way that mattered? Obviously, people didn't stay behind all the time, or there would be a lot more evidence of ghosts. She didn't have answers to any of these things, but she was still going to stay. She walked away from the light and felt her feet sink into the floor at first, but eventually they began to solidify when she concentrated on walking above the ground. What she thought, what she believed, mattered. Much to her surprise, the white light did not go away like it did in the movies. It followed her, and she could tell that it was slowly growing more peaceful. It was going to take an act of deliberate willpower to keep trying to find a way to affect things here. That was fine. She had all the willpower it might take to get that son of a bitch Jarvie. Though she stopped when she realized that, being a sorcerer, he could probably see her. What if he trapped her somehow? She needed a course of action, but was going back to Jarvie's side wise? She decided it was. In her short time with him, she'd never heard him talking about trapping ghosts, or even about ghosts at all, only zombies, winning his bet, and occasionally sex. She would be careful, but she had to at least try defeating him. She kept moving back toward Jarvie. Jarvie's sources inside the town reported that the boat had been blown to smithereens. As soon as the Snark radioed him, he said to Laura,
"I apologize. You were right. If I had gone on that boat, I don't know if the animal would have been enough to shield me."
Laura smiled and put the grapes of wrath down on the steps of Jarvie's marble dais. The dais had a throne with gold trim and was borne palanquin style by 4 of the zombie soldiers. They were ridiculously strong. She leaned on the arm of the chair and put her finger to his nose. She said, "Good for you." She paused a moment, then asked, "Do you know if they know or not?" Jarvie thought a moment and then shook his head.
"They probably don't," he said. "My spies can only give me the information they hear. The leaders of the town may know more."
"Then maybe you should fool them into thinking you've already been killed. If things dramatically change, then they'll let their guard down." He thought about it a moment and then nodded.
"You've got a good point. Let's give it a try."
He looked at the heavens and muttered a few command words. The clouds parted and sunlight began to pour through. The sunlight would keep the dead from being reanimated in the area, but he could always bring the clouds back. He commanded the zombies to scatter, moving them aimlessly in all directions with a few bumping up against the walls of the town. Those were easily killed. As a ray of sunlight lit up the town, he could hear the cheering from people inside the walls. Jarvie felt his heart warm for them. He had never been cruel, but then he'd never really been on the inside of a truly cruel joke before. They actually thought it was over. He considered laughing hysterically, but he wasn't going to take any chances. They might have an airplane in there somewhere. He wanted to be hidden. He ordered the palanquin to take him toward an abandoned factory within a few miles of the town, where he would hole up and wait out the gloom. Jarvie looked at Laura, whose face was curiously natural.
"So you don't feel sorry for them?" he asked her.
"A bit, but I'm here and they're not, so what's a girl to do? Guilt makes my digestion harder. Most guilt is useless anyway." The palanquin moved across the road into the factory, its giant door sliding open like the drawbridge of a Titanic castle. The zombie soldiers seemed to mutter quietly at the indignity of their assignment, but they kept their voices very low, so understanding the words was impossible for a human ear. Jarvie swung his legs over the left arm of the throne and asked Laura,
"You don't think any kind of external agency judges our actions?"
"I don't know. But I do know that our emotions are our own. That's how we make choices. If we can't make choices, we don't have free will." Jarvie popped a grape into his mouth. He looked down at the small plastic cooler beside him. If he was really that powerful, he should be able to conjure things from thin air. You never saw small plastic coolers in fantasy paintings. Then again, you never saw a lot of things in small plastic coolers either.
"Thanks. Can we change the subject now?"
"Hey, I'm reading The Grapes of Wrath. What do you expect?"
"More insight into how I can instigate wrath, less about grapes."
Jarvie fished around in the cooler. It was empty again. He was going to have to send out more zombies for food. He was definitely going to have to keep more of civilization intact once he was done. Not being able to order out for pizza was annoying. Laura moved off the dais' steps to the floor. She went over to the wall, broke the glass, and took out a fire extinguisher. Then she walked back to Jarvie and handed it to him. Jarvie looked at the fire extinguisher and then looked at her.
"What am I supposed to do with this?"
Laura took a step back and looked cryptic. She said, "It is a metaphor."
"What's that supposed to mean?"
"Exactly." She then sat down and proceeded to read her book again. Jarvie almost crushed her at that moment. He could do it. He was quite confident he could make her burst like a ripe watermelon. But he waited. He wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. He stared at the fire extinguisher. Jarvie pondered while Laura giggled at something she read in the book. Jarvie waited 16 hours. He didn't know where they'd gotten the fireworks, but they lit up the night. He could hear music blaring from the town. They had to be at least a mile away. He was rather amazed that they thought it had been this easy after all of the preparations they'd made, but quite frankly he didn't care. He extended his will and called the scattered zombies back to him. The town wasn't going to be celebrating quite as much in the immediate future. Laura put the book away and got back onto the dais. On a whim, Jarvie left the palanquin behind and pulled her after him as they floated out of factory. They were going to town. Ozark walked after Jarvie. The light was almost intolerable now. It was harder and harder to perceive the old world, but she would not give up. She kept following after him, and when she saw that he was putting on normal clothing instead of those goofy wizard robes he'd been wearing up till now, she knew she had to find a way to warn people in town. But how? She saw the 2 of them float off and ran after them.